Did you know that in 1944, one out of every four married women worked outside the home? Just a few years earlier, that was unthinkable. Did you know that at the peak of the war, a massive B-24 bomber rolled off the assembly line at the Willow Run factory every 63 minutes? The people making that happen weren't just men. Millions of them were women. They were welders, riveters, electricians, and mechanics. They built the machines that powered a global war. We have these images in our heads, these black and white photos of women in coveralls, hair tied up in bandanas, smiling confidently with a rivet gun in hand. But who were they, really? What did it smell like in those factories? What did it feel like to leave your kids at a daycare you'd never seen before to go work a 10-hour shift with heavy machinery? And what happened to them when the war was over and the men came home? These aren't just pictures on a wall. They are stories of a revolution that happened almost overnight and then just as quickly was told to go back in the kitchen. Number 10, what was normal before the storm. Before the posters and the propaganda, before the call to arms, life for most American women followed a script. It was a script written by generations of tradition and reinforced by the harsh realities of the Great Depression. The 1930s were a decade of survival. Jobs were scarce for everyone, but for women, the cultural pressure was immense. The prevailing idea was simple. A woman's place was in the home. Her role was to be a wife and a mother. If a woman took a job, the thinking went, she was taking it away from a man who needed to support his family. This wasn't just an opinion, it was often policy. A 1936 Gallup poll asked if married women should work. An overwhelming 82% of Americans said no. The federal government itself acted on this belief. Section 213 of the 1932 Federal Economy Act made it illegal for both members of a married couple to work for the federal government. Since men were almost always the higher earners, it was the women who were let go. Many states and private companies had similar rules. They were called marriage bars. A woman, particularly a teacher or a secretary, was often expected to resign the day she got married. The jobs that were considered women's work were limited. They were usually extensions of domestic roles, nursing, teaching, sewing in a textile mill, or serving as a domestic helper. In offices, they were typists and telephone operators. These jobs were almost always lower paying and had little to no path for advancement. The world of heavy industry, of machinery, of welding and riveting and greasy engines was a man's world. The thought of a woman working on an assembly line building a car, let alone a bomber, was not just unusual, it was seen as fundamentally unnatural. In 1940, on the eve of the Great Industrial Mobilization, women made up only 25% of the total workforce. And of those working women, the vast majority were young and single. Once a woman married, the expectation was that her working life was over. Of course, this normal wasn't the same for everyone. For African American women, the choice to work or not was a luxury they rarely had. Economic necessity meant they had always worked in large numbers, but they were relegated to the lowest paying jobs, primarily as domestic servants or agricultural laborers. The historian Jacqueline Jones, in her book A Labor of Love, Labor of Sorrow, details how black women faced what she calls a double day long before it became a mainstream concept, balancing grueling, underpaid work with the full responsibility of their own homes and families. For poor white women in rural areas or factory towns, the reality was also one of hard labor, but the cultural ideal they were measured against was always that of the stay-at-home wife. The culture reinforced this script at every turn. Magazines, radio programs, and movies all celebrated the domestic goddess. Advertisements were aimed at the housewife, selling her new appliances to make her domestic work more efficient. The message was clear: a woman's fulfillment and her contribution to society were to be found within the four walls of her home. The skills she was encouraged to learn were cooking, cleaning, and raising children. The world outside was not her domain. It was against this deeply ingrained backdrop of social norms and economic limitations that the call would come. The world was about to change, and the script was about to be torn to pieces. The women who would soon be building bombers and ships were, in 1940, secretaries, waitresses, farm wives, and high school students who expected their lives to be just like their mothers. They had no idea they were about to step into a completely different world. But, looking back, how much of that domestic ideal was a carefully constructed fantasy? Were women in the 1930s truly content with such limited roles, or were they simply making the best of a world with no other options? And if the Great Depression hadn't created such widespread unemployment, would the resistance to women working have been as strong? What simmering frustrations and hidden ambitions lay beneath the surface of that so-called normal life? Number 9, why did they suddenly need women in factories? The change did not happen slowly, it happened with the force of an explosion. On December 7th, 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor shattered America's sense of security and plunged the nation into a global conflict it could no longer ignore. President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed the nation, calling for an unprecedented level of production. He didn't ask for a few more planes or a few more ships. He set goals that sounded impossible. In his 1942 State of the Union address, he called for 60,000 airplanes, 45,000 tanks, and 8 million tons of shipping in that year alone. The numbers were staggering. The country was to become, in his words, the arsenal of democracy. But there was a huge problem. To build this arsenal, you needed workers. And the very men who would normally work in the factories were the ones being drafted to go fight. Millions of them. The assembly lines at Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler stopped making cars and started retooling to build engines, tanks, and aircraft. The shipyards on the West Coast, like the massive Kaiser shipyards in California and Oregon, needed to operate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The existing workforce of men was simply not enough to meet the demand. There was a massive labor shortage. At first, factory managers were deeply skeptical. They were men of a certain generation, steeped in the belief that women were not suited for industrial work. They argued that women weren't strong enough to handle the heavy machinery. They said women were too emotional and couldn't handle the pressure of production deadlines. They worried that women would be a distraction to the men who were left. The resistance was real. As documented in Emily Yellen's book, Our Mother's War, foremen would often complain that women lacked mechanical aptitude and were difficult to train. They saw women not as a solution, but as a new set of problems. But the government and the war industry had no choice. The demand for weapons and equipment was insatiable. The War Manpower Commission was established in 1942 to manage the allocation of labor. It quickly became clear that the only untapped labor pool large enough to fill the gap was women. So the government, in partnership with industry, launched one of the most effective and widespread propaganda campaigns in American history. They had to convince not only the factory managers, but the women themselves and their families. They had to completely reverse the cultural messaging of the previous decade. The Office of War Information was created to oversee this effort. They used every medium available. Posters appeared everywhere, in post offices, in train stations, on factory walls. They featured strong, capable, yet still feminine women in work clothes, contributing to the war effort. Magazines that just months before had been filled with articles on housekeeping now ran stories celebrating the patriotic women on the assembly line. Both films and newsreels showed women confidently operating complex machinery, their work directly linked to saving the lives of their husbands, sons, and brothers overseas. The message was powerful and direct: your country needs you. Winning the war depends on you. This isn't just a job, it's a patriotic duty. The campaign was a phenomenal success. It made factory work not just acceptable for women, but glamorous and heroic. Millions of women who had never imagined themselves holding a welding torch or a rivet gun started lining up at the factory gates. What if the propaganda campaign had failed? Could the United States have produced the materials needed to fight the war without the massive influx of female labor? And how much of the initial resistance from factory managers was genuine concern, and how much was simply prejudice and a fear of losing control over their male-dominated world? Was there a single moment or a single person who finally broke the dam of resistance and convinced industry to give women a chance? Number 8, who was the real Rosie the Riveter? When we think of women in the war industry, one image usually comes to mind: a woman in a blue work shirt, her hair tied up in a red and white polka dot bandana, flexing her bicep under the words, "We can do it." This poster, created by J. Howard Miller for the Westinghouse Electric Corporation in 1943, has become an iconic symbol of female empowerment. But here's the strange part: during the war, almost no one saw it. It was displayed only briefly and only within Westinghouse factories, meant to boost morale and discourage strikes. It only became famous decades later, in the 1980s, when it was rediscovered and adopted by the feminist movement. The more famous Rosie during the war was a different image entirely. It was the one on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post for May 29, 1943. Painted by the celebrated artist Norman Rockwell, this Rosie is a brawny, red-headed woman in overalls, sitting down for her lunch break with a massive rivet gun on her lap. Her foot rests on a copy of Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf. She looks powerful, confident, and a little bit grimy. This was the Rosie America knew. Rockwell's model was a 19-year-old telephone operator from Vermont named Mary Doyle Keefe, who was small and petite. Rockwell apologized to her later for making her look so large, explaining that he wanted to convey a sense of strength and power. But Rosie the Riveter wasn't just a poster or a painting. She was a character born from a song. In 1942, a popular song written by Red Evans and John Jacob Loeb hit the radio waves. It was called Rosie the Riveter, and it told the story of a woman who was making history, working for victory. The song was a hit, and the name Rosie became a popular nickname for all women working in the war industries. The government and media latched onto it. They needed a symbol, a human face for this massive social experiment. There were also real women who became the face of the movement. One of the most prominent was Roswell Monroe. She was a real-life riveter, a single mother of two from Kentucky who went to work at the massive Willow Run bomber plant in Michigan. She was discovered by Hollywood actor Walter Pidgeon, who was touring the plant to make a promotional film for war bonds. She was photogenic, articulate, and had a great backstory. She fit the bill perfectly. She starred in the film and went on a national tour, becoming a living embodiment of the Rosie the Riveter ideal. She was the proof that the women in the factories were not just abstract numbers, but real patriots. The Rosie campaign was a masterful piece of public relations. It managed to do something very tricky. It celebrated the strength and competence of these women in traditionally male roles, but it was careful to frame it as a temporary sacrifice for the war. The propaganda often emphasized the femininity of the workers. Articles would talk about how women would put on lipstick before their shift, or how they managed to keep their homes tidy even after a long day at the factory. This was to reassure a nervous public that these women weren't losing their womanliness. They were just stepping up for the duration of the emergency. They were still wives, mothers, and sweethearts at heart. The message was she can build a bomber, but she's still the girl next door. This delicate balancing act was crucial to making the whole social transformation palatable to mainstream America. The character of Rosie was a hero, but a temporary one. If the We Can Do It poster was largely unseen during the war, why has it so completely overshadowed Rockwell's painting in modern memory? What does its later adoption as a feminist icon say about our changing views of women in work? And how did the real women like Roswell Monroe feel about being turned into living symbols? Did they feel empowered, or did they feel used by the propaganda machine? Number 7. What? Did it actually feel like to build a bomber? Imagine stepping into a place like the Willow Run factory in Michigan. It was a building so vast it was hard to see from one end to the other. It was a mile long. Inside, the noise was a physical force. It was a constant, deafening roar of machinery, of rivet guns that sounded like thousands of machine guns firing at once, of cranes screeching overhead as they moved entire sections of an airplane wing. The air was thick with the smell of hot metal, oil, and welding fumes. It was a world of overwhelming scale and organized chaos. And into this world walked millions of women who, just weeks before, might have been working in a quiet library or a small town diner. The work was not easy. It was physically demanding and often dangerous. A riveter worked in a two-person team. One person, the bucker, would be on the inside of the fuselage or wing, holding a heavy steel bar, a bucking bar, against a rivet. The other person, the unner, on the outside, would use a pneumatic rivet gun to drive the hot rivet into the hole. The coordination had to be perfect. A slip could mean a ruined piece of aluminum or a serious injury. Women often proved to be better at this than men, particularly in tight spaces. Their smaller hands and frames allowed them to squeeze into cramped sections of the aircraft that larger men couldn't reach. Welding was another common job, peering through the dark glass of a welder's mask. A woman would hold an electrode, creating an intensely bright arc of electricity that melted metal together. It required an incredibly steady hand and intense focus. The light was blinding, and the sparks could cause nasty burns. They wore heavy leather aprons, gloves, and helmets to protect themselves, even in the sweltering heat of summer in a factory with no air conditioning. Many women ended up with what they called welder's flash, a painful inflammation of the cornea, like a sunburn on the eyes. Beyond the physical danger, there was the sheer monotony and pressure. These women worked 10 or 12-hour shifts 6 days a week. They were on their feet the entire time. The assembly line moved at a relentless pace. At the peak of production, as mentioned, a finished B-24 Liberator bomber, a plane with over 1 million parts, rolled out of Willow Run every single hour. A woman might spend her entire shift doing one single repetitive task, drilling the same 3 holes, welding the same seam, or inspecting the same set of wires over and over again. The pressure to work fast was immense, but a single mistake could have catastrophic consequences. A poorly driven rivet or a faulty wire could mean the failure of an aircraft and the loss of its crew. Despite the hardships, many women found a deep sense of pride and camaraderie in their work. In her book, A Mouthful of Rivets, Nancy Baker Wise tells the stories of these women who spoke of the thrill of seeing a massive bomber they had helped build take flight for the first time. They learned new skills, they earned their own money, and they were part of something bigger than themselves. They formed tight-knit groups on the factory floor, sharing stories, jokes, and childcare tips. They were not just co-workers, they were women united in a common purpose. They were proving to themselves and to the world that they could do the man's work and do it well. How did these women cope with the constant, deafening noise of the factory floor? What were the long-term health effects of daily exposure to welding fumes, metal dust, and chemical solvents, which were poorly understood at the time? We have the production numbers and the famous photos, but what about the unrecorded stories of accidents, injuries, and the sheer mental exhaustion of working under such intense pressure for years on end? Number 6, could you be a welder and a mother at the same time? For millions of women, the factory shift was only half the job. When they punched out after 10 or 12 hours of grueling industrial labor, they went home to their second shift cooking, cleaning, and caring for their children. These women were not just workers, they were mothers, wives, and daughters. The war effort may have opened the factory doors to them, but it did little to change the expectation that they were still solely responsible for the home. This double burden was one of the most significant and overlooked challenges faced by the Rosies. Before the war, childcare was a private family matter. A mother stayed home, or perhaps a grandmother or aunt lived nearby to help. But with millions of mothers now working full-time, and with many families dislocated and living far from relatives in new wartime housing projects, the nation faced a childcare crisis. What were women supposed to do with their young children while they were building ships and planes? At first, the solutions were makeshift and often desperate. Stories abounded of women locking their children in their homes or even in their cars in the factory parking lot during their shifts. These became known as latchkey children, a term that gained currency during this period. The social consequences were real, with rising concerns about juvenile delinquency and child neglect. The government was slow to respond. There was a deep-seated ideological resistance to the idea of group childcare. Many believed it would weaken the family unit and was a step toward the kind of state-controlled systems seen in the countries America was fighting against. However, the reality of industrial need eventually forced their hand. Absenteeism among women workers was high, often because of childcare problems. A woman couldn't come to work if her child was sick. In 1943, the federal government passed the Lanham Act, which provided federal funds for communities to build and operate daycare centers in war-impacted areas. These Lanham Act centers were a revolutionary concept for their time. They were often open 24 hours a day to accommodate women working all 3 shifts. They provided not just supervision, but also nutritious meals and basic health care. The quality of these centers was, by many accounts, remarkably high. The historian William M. Tuttle, Jr., in his research on the American home front, has highlighted how these centers were staffed by trained professionals and offered a level of care that was far beyond mere babysitting. For many children, it was their first experience with structured learning and socializing. For the mothers, it was a lifeline. It allowed them to work with the peace of mind that their children were safe. However, these centers were the exception, not the rule. At their peak, they only served about 130,000 children, a small fraction of the millions who needed care. Many women still had to rely on informal arrangements with neighbors, older children, or paid but unregulated caregivers. And the societal judgment was ever present. Women who worked were often criticized for neglecting their families, even as they were celebrated as patriotic heroes in government propaganda. They were caught in a cultural crossfire. They were told to go to work for their country, but they were also told that a good mother was always at home. This balancing act, the constant juggling of 2 demanding and conflicting roles, defined the daily reality for a huge number of women during the war. How many women quit their factory jobs? Not because they couldn't do the work, but because the burden of childcare and housework was simply too much to bear. What was the long-term psychological impact on the children who spent their formative years in these new daycare centers or as latchkey kids? And why, after the war, were the highly successful Lanham Act child care centers almost all immediately shut down, erasing a potential model for national child care for decades to come? Number 5. Did every Rosie look the same? The popular image of Rosie the Riveter is almost always of a white woman. The posters, the magazine covers, the newsreels, they overwhelmingly featured white faces. But the reality on the factory floor was far more complex and diverse. The call for workers was so great that it began to pry open doors that had long been sealed shut for women of color. For African American women in particular, the war represented a profound, if fraught, opportunity. It was a chance to escape the low-wage trap of domestic service and agricultural labor and enter the industrial workforce for the first time. But they faced immense barriers. At the beginning of the war mobilization, many defense contractors simply refused to hire black workers, male or female. This blatant discrimination led to a powerful response from the African American community. Philip Randolph, a prominent labor leader, organized the March on Washington movement in 1941, threatening to bring 100,000 black protesters to the Capitol unless the government took action to end segregation in the defense industry. Fearing the political and social disruption of such a march during a national emergency, President Roosevelt relented. He issued Executive Order 8802, which banned racial discrimination in the defense industry and created the Fair Employment Practices Committee (FEPC) to investigate complaints. The order had no real enforcement power, but it was a crucial symbolic step. It cracked the door open. Black women began to get hired, but their struggle was far from over. When they did get into the factories, they were often given the worst, most difficult, and lowest paying jobs. They faced hostility and prejudice from both white male and white female coworkers. Workplaces were often segregated, with separate facilities and production lines. The historian Maureen Honey, in her book Creating Rosie the Riveter, analyzes the propaganda of the era and notes how it almost exclusively focused on a white middle-class version of womanhood, effectively rendering the contributions of black women invisible to the wider public. Despite these challenges, over 600,000 black women entered the industrial workforce during the war. For them, the fight was on two fronts. They were part of the national effort against the Axis powers, but they were also fighting for their own civil rights and economic survival at home. This was encapsulated in the WWII campaign, a slogan promoted by the black press, which stood for victory abroad and victory at home over tyranny and discrimination. These black Rosies were pioneers, breaking down barriers and challenging the racial hierarchy of the American workplace. Other women of color also played a vital role. Latino women, particularly in the Southwest, took jobs in aircraft plants and shipyards. The Bracero program, an agreement between the U.S. and Mexico to bring in temporary agricultural workers, also had an indirect impact on women's labor, as families moved and new communities formed around industrial centers. In places like Los Angeles, young Mexican-American women, sometimes called pachucas, developed a distinct style and culture, challenging both mainstream American and traditional Mexican gender norms. Asian American women, though fewer in number, also contributed, while at the same time, thousands of Japanese American women were being forced into internment camps with their families, a stark contradiction of the nation's fight for freedom. The story of women on the home front is not one single story. It is a mosaic of different experiences, shaped by the pervasive realities of race and class. How many complaints of racial discrimination were filed with the FEP by women, and how many of them actually resulted in meaningful change? What were the relationships like between white and black women on the factory floor? Was it all hostility, or were there instances of solidarity and friendship that have gone unrecorded? And how did the experience of earning an industrial wage, even a discriminatory one, change the economic expectations and aspirations of minority women and their families after the war? Number 4, were they paid a man's wage for a man's work? The promise of good pay was one of the most powerful lures that drew women into the factories. For many, it was the first time in their lives they had the chance to earn a substantial independent income. A woman who had been making 25 cents an hour as a waitress could suddenly earn 90 cents an hour or more on an assembly line. This economic empowerment was transformative. It gave women a new sense of freedom and possibility. The government and industry promoted the idea of equal pay for equal work. The National War Labor Board, in a series of rulings, endorsed the principle of equal pay for equal work, stating that there should be no wage discrimination based on sex. But the reality was often very different from the official policy. The principle was full of loopholes. The most common tactic used by employers was to simply reclassify the jobs that women were doing. A job that had been called drill press operator, when a man did it, would be renamed small drill press operator when a woman took over with a correspondingly lower wage. Companies would make superficial changes to the job description or the production process and use that as a justification to pay women less. They argued that women required extra supervision or special assistance with heavy lifting, and therefore their work was not truly equal to that of a man. The result was a persistent and significant wage gap. On average, women in manufacturing earned about 65% of what men did for similar work. While unions like the United Auto Workers UAW and the United Electrical Workers UE officially supported the idea of equal pay, they often struggled to enforce it on the factory floor. The unions were in a difficult position. They wanted to protect the wage standards for their male members who would be returning after the war. They worried that if companies were allowed to pay women less for the same job, they would continue to do so after the war, driving down wages for everyone. So, while they fought against the reclassification of jobs, their primary loyalty was often to their long-term male members, not the new influx of temporary female workers. Susan B. Anthony II, the grandniece of the famous suffragist, worked as a journalist during the war and wrote a book titled Out of the Kitchen into the War. She documented these disparities firsthand, noting the frustration of women who knew they were being underpaid for doing the exact same tasks as the men next to them. This frustration sometimes boiled over. There were instances of women organizing walkouts and small-scale strikes to protest unequal pay and poor working conditions. These actions, however, were often frowned upon by both the government and the public, who saw any disruption of war production as unpatriotic. The money women did earn had a profound impact. It allowed them to support their families, sometimes as the sole breadwinner while their husbands were away. And it gave them purchasing power and a degree of economic independence they had never known. They bought war bonds, but they also saved for new homes, for their children's education, or just for the security of having money in the bank. This taste of economic freedom was a powerful experience, and it would not be easily forgotten. It fundamentally changed their perception of their own capabilities and their own worth, both inside and outside the home. Did companies keep detailed records of how they reclassified jobs to justify lower pay for women, and do those records still exist in corporate archives? How did the gender wage gap in the war industries compare to the gap in other sectors of the economy at the time? And what happened in the rare cases where a union local genuinely and successfully fought for and won equal pay for its female members? Did those victories last, or were they rolled back as soon as the war ended? Number 3, how did they cope when the bombs weren't falling on them? The American home front was not a combat zone. Unlike in London, Berlin, or Tokyo, cities were not being bombed. There was no invading army. But the war was a constant looming presence in everyday life. It created a unique psychological landscape of anxiety, grief, and relentless pressure. The women in the factories lived with the daily awareness that the bombers and ships they were building were being sent directly into violent conflict. They knew that their husbands, brothers, sons, and neighbors were the ones flying those planes and sailing those ships. Every woman working on an assembly line had a personal connection to the war. They would write letters during their breaks and wait anxiously for a response. They would scan the casualty lists that were published in the local newspapers, praying not to see a familiar name. The star system was a common sight in neighborhoods across the country. A family would hang a small banner with a blue star in their window for each family member serving in the military. If that person was killed, the blue star was replaced with a gold one. Seeing a gold star in a neighbor's window was a somber, constant reminder of the human cost of the conflict. This background anxiety was coupled with the physical and mental exhaustion of the work itself. The long hours, the demanding labor, and the pressure to produce created a high-stress environment. Women had to cope with new fears, the fear of a serious accident with the machinery, the fear of making a mistake that could endanger a soldier, the fear of what the future held. The government and media tried to channel these anxieties into productive energy. War bond drives, rationing programs, and scrap metal collections were all ways of making people on the home front feel like they were actively participating in the fight. Propaganda posters urged silence with slogans like "Loose lips sink ships," creating an atmosphere where even casual conversation could feel fraught with danger. To cope, women built powerful communities. They relied on each other. The camaraderie on the factory floor was a vital support system. They shared news from the front, offered a shoulder to cry on, and helped each other with practical problems like finding groceries with their ration books or arranging childcare. In the booming war towns that sprang up around factories and shipyards, new communities were forged out of necessity. People from all over the country were thrown together in hastily constructed housing projects. These new environments, free from the constraints of old hometowns, sometimes allowed for new kinds of social interactions, though they were also often strained by overcrowding and a lack of basic services. Entertainment provided an escape. Movie theaters were packed. People flocked to see Hollywood films that were often patriotic and optimistic, offering a clear vision of good versus evil and the promise of eventual victory. Big bands and USO dances provided a chance to forget the war for a few hours. The women who worked in the factories would shed their greasy overalls, put on their best dresses, and go dancing. It was a way to feel young and alive in a world dominated by work and worry. They were living in a strange paradox. Their lives were filled with newfound purpose and opportunity, but also with a constant underlying fear and the ever-present shadow of loss. We know about the official efforts to boost morale, but what were the private, informal coping mechanisms women developed that were never written down? Were there organized support groups for war wives and mothers? And if so, how did they function? And what was the prevalence of what we would now call PTSD or anxiety disorders among home front workers who were living under constant stress and dealing with the grief of losing loved ones from thousands of miles away? Number two, what happened when the men came home? The end of the war in 1945 was met with a massive wave of celebration and relief. VE Day and VJ Day saw spontaneous parties erupt in streets across the country. The long, exhausting years of sacrifice were finally over, but for the millions of women working in the defense industries, the celebration was bittersweet. It also signaled the end of their time in the factory, the message that had been drilled into them for 4 years. Your country needs you changed overnight. The new message was just as clear: go home. The same propaganda machine that had lured women into the factories was now put into reverse. Advertisements and magazine articles began to glorify domesticity once again. The ideal American woman was no longer Rosie the Riveter in her practical overalls, but a smiling housewife in an apron, happily using a new vacuum cleaner. The government and industry had a new problem. Millions of soldiers were returning home, and they needed jobs. The prevailing belief was that women should gracefully step aside and give their jobs back to the returning veterans. It was framed, once again, as their patriotic duty. The layoffs began almost immediately. Within a month of VJ Day, hundreds of thousands of women were let go from their jobs in aircraft plants and shipyards. The seniority systems in most union contracts favored men, so women, who were the last hired, were the first fired. Some women left voluntarily. They were exhausted from years of hard labor and were eager to reunite with their husbands and return to a more normal life. They had seen their work as a temporary necessity and were ready for it to be over. But many, many others did not want to leave. They had grown to love the independence, the sense of purpose, and most importantly, the paycheck that came with their jobs. Surveys conducted at the time revealed this conflict. A 1945 survey by the Women's Bureau of the Department of Labor found that 75% of the women who had taken war jobs wanted to continue working. They had proven their abilities, and they didn't want to go back to being economically dependent, but the options were limited. The high-paying, skilled industrial jobs they had held were now closed to them. They were pushed back into the traditional women's work sectors, clerical, service, and retail jobs, which paid significantly less. The marriage bars, which had been suspended during the war, were often reinstated. The social pressure was intense. Women who wanted to keep working were sometimes seen as selfish or unpatriotic, as taking a job away from a deserving veteran. There was a widespread cultural anxiety about the masculinizing effect the war had on women. Experts wrote articles about the importance of women re-embracing their femininity to help returning soldiers readjust to civilian life. The entire nation seemed to be engaged in a collective effort to turn back the clock, to restore the pre-war social order where men were the breadwinners and women were the homemakers. The revolutionary Rosie the Riveter was being politely but firmly shown the door. How many women actively fought their layoffs, filing grievances with their unions, or trying to find other industrial jobs? What was the psychological impact of being celebrated as a hero one day and told you were no longer needed the next? And was there any significant public debate at the time about the fairness of this mass firing? Or was the go back to the kitchen narrative so powerful that it drowned out any dissenting voices? Number one, did Rosie really change anything? This is the big question. Was the Rosie the Riveter experience a genuine turning point for American women, or was it just a temporary blip, a brief deviation from the norm that was quickly corrected? The answer is complicated. For decades, the prevailing historical view was that Rosie had a limited long-term impact. After all, the 1950s are remembered as the golden age of the American housewife and the baby boom. The feminine mystique, as Betty Friedan would later call it, seemed to erase the memory of the woman welder. The number of women in heavy industry plummeted after 1945. The gender wage gap remained wide. The cultural ideal of a woman's place being in the home came back with a vengeance. From this perspective, the revolution was televised and then it was canceled. But a closer look reveals a more nuanced legacy. The seeds of change were planted, even if they took a long time to sprout. First, the war permanently changed the demographics of the female workforce. While the young single Rosies were pushed out of their industrial jobs, a new group of women entered and stayed in the workforce in the post-war years older, married women. The percentage of married women who worked outside the home never returned to its pre-war lows. The war had broken a major psychological barrier. It had shown that women, including mothers, could be competent and reliable employees. Second, the experience changed the women themselves. For millions of them, it was a taste of a different kind of life. They learned new skills, they managed their own money, and they experienced the camaraderie and sense of self-worth that came from doing a challenging job well. As historian Alice Kessler-Harris argues, this experience may not have led them to immediately storm the barricades of patriarchy, but it created a new set of expectations and a new consciousness about their own potential. They may have returned to the kitchen, but they did so as different women than the ones who had left. This new consciousness was passed on to their daughters. The women who grew up in the 1950s and 1960s saw their mothers not just as homemakers, but as women who had once built bombers. The stories of their mothers' wartime experiences provided a powerful alternative role model. It's no coincidence that the modern feminist movement exploded in the late 1960s, led by the daughters of the Rosie the Riveter generation. The Rosies had proven that the old definitions of women's work were arbitrary. Their daughters would demand that those definitions be torn down for good. The war also had a lasting impact on public policy. The GI Bill, for example, is rightly celebrated for expanding access to higher education and home ownership for millions of veterans. But it also reinforced the gender roles of the era, overwhelmingly benefiting men and creating a post-war middle class where the male breadwinner model was king. The brief experiment with federally funded childcare through the Lanham Act was abandoned, a decision that has had repercussions for working mothers for the rest of the 20th century and beyond. So the legacy is mixed. The war opened doors, but then many of them were slammed shut again. It was not a simple linear path to liberation. It was a complex, contradictory event that both advanced and retarded the cause of women's equality. The astonishing photos of women building bombers are not just images of the past. They are a snapshot of a revolution in progress, a revolution whose aftershocks are still being felt today. Did the daughters of the Rosies consciously see their mother's wartime work as an inspiration for their own feminist activism, or was the connection more subconscious? How many women used the skills they learned in the factory's mechanical, electrical, organizational less in their later lives, even in unpaid domestic roles? And perhaps the biggest question of all, if the Second World War had never happened, how much longer would it have taken for American women to enter the workforce in such massive numbers and challenge the deep-seated cultural norms that had defined their lives for centuries?